everyone. Welcome to Only Realty Property Investing Series Session 6. This is our last one today, and not can't say I'm looking forward to the end of it, but it's been quite an interesting sort of journey going down this route of sharing sort of property investment tips, secrets, ideas, thoughts around that, and we had loads of useful questions as well during the series. So thanks to those of you who have joined us consistently and consecutively during the last 6 weeks now of the Only Realty Property Investment Series. So today is, like I said, the last day. Again, just going to share my screen and go through the presentation. We also fortunately have one of our business partners with us, or an attorney from Haydar Inc. It's Leah Haydar, and he's going to just be sharing some ideas and tips around evictions today and thoughts. So just going to bring up my share screen here for you. So the schedule that we've gone through so far is we did strategy, goals, and expert team leading up to this, and then we did asset protection on day 2, structure and financing. Day 3 we did the offer to purchase and conveyancing process, with day 4 being the tools and research you go through to look at properties when you're going to start investing. Last week we did running the numbers, and I really focused on return on investment, and then today we're going to do property management, the Rental Housing Act, and evictions. So be a nice day, just discussing how you bought your property, how you look after it, and what are the things that you do to make sure that it's a efficient and effective investment for your really giving the returns that you expect in terms of return investment calculation we did last week. So just this is a Zoom webinar, and just a sort of reminder, there's a chat box function that you can use to chat. If you've got anything to say, any questions while you go through, just use the chat box functionality. This is more of a conversation tool. The next one would be the Q&A box. So that's just asking the questions, and what I've done is I've enabled the fact that you guys can vote up any questions. So if you want to, if you see a question that you like, that you want to vote it up, and I'll answer that first, you can vote that up. You can also comment on somebody else's question if you want to expand on the question for any reason. We'll go from there. Then it's an interactive session, so please ask me questions. Please stop me if I'm going too fast, or you want me to dig into something deeper. Just put a chat up, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat so I can be able to see what information you might need. I'll say I'll answer later in the series, but now I'm going to say early in the series. If you do ask a question that there's an answer early in the series, I will point you to the session. We've put them all on YouTube, so if you just look for the Only Realty YouTube channel, you'll be able to find all of the 5 sessions plus this one posted there that you can make use of and refer to on an ongoing basis. And the recordings are available after the session on YouTube, so please feel free to do that. Take a look there. So just a quick introduction. My name is Grant Smee. I'm the Managing Director of Only Realty, have been for the better part of 9 years. I've been involved with Only Realty since 2011, I think it is. And now with my partners, we run Only Realty National Head Office and own one of the franchises myself. We also have, I have the founder of Epic South Africa, which is a platform for entrepreneurs and property investors, and we support them through education, training, and building of community. And the last one, I'm a property investor, and that's again why I'm here today speaking to you about property investment, and it's really the core of everything that I do. Property, there's a property link to everything that I do, but it started out in the property investment space. I have a property portfolio, continue to maintain and look to build that on an ongoing basis. So again, I'm a property investor at my core. So just a revision of everything that we've been doing, and I'm going to go revision day 1 through 5, quick 5 minutes on that, and then dig into day 6, Property Management, Rental Housing Act, and then evictions. So first and foremost, we focus on strategy and goals in day 1, and what we really looked at was your goal. What is the goal that you're looking to achieve out of your property investment strategy or property investment journey? It's pointless getting into any investment strategy or doing anything in investment, whether it's property as an asset, a business, or anything else, without having a very clear goal of what you're trying to achieve. And the reason for that is you need to then pick the strategy that you're going with to align with that goal. The example here is if you want to go on a big holiday once a year and you need a lump sum of money every year, it's really pointless going to buy-to-let space where you're going to have small annuity amounts that are going to come towards you. You're not going to have that lump sum of money every year to be able to go on holiday. So it's a quick example. And then I discussed capital, so looking at capital flips as an example, or what capital strategies are. And the part that I really focused on for this series was cash flow. which is the creation of that annuity income when you're going to invest in property. Part of day one was also then looking at the experts that you all have involved in your property investment business and their roles, as well as their locations. So we spoke about geographical and non-geographical experts. Example, your accountant is a non-geographical, they don't need to be anywhere near the property, whereas your architect potentially or your builder needs to be geographical, so it needs to be where the property is. Day two, we spoke about asset protection structures and finance, and I spoke about the interdependent relationship between the investment structure that's used and the finance that you obtain for your journey, as well as the, I then spoke a little bit about leverage, the fact that you put a small deposit down, you get finance for the majority of the cost of your building, but then you benefit 100% from the capital appreciation linked to that property. And that's the big idea behind leverage, leveraging your asset, and the big advantage using property as your asset class versus any other asset class. We then looked at 11 other ways you could potentially finance your business or your property investment journey, and that's taking normal mortgages, vanilla mortgage out of the frame, and putting in what are the other ways that I can finance my property investment journey. How do I buy more properties? What are the things I can do? I went through 11 other ways you could do that there. That was in day two. And then beyond that, once you've got your portfolio, you've built your portfolio, I spoke about the generic asset protection structure. That would be yourself, where you're the trustee of a trust. You and another person, at least one independent trustee, as well as yourself to the trust. And then you will own the share, or the trust will own the shares in the property investment business. Trust will also own shares in your other trading businesses, and you and your loved ones will be the beneficiaries of that structure. And you'll be the director of the companies, the trading companies you have, standing surety for those companies or in your finance, but you'll have operational control of those businesses. Day three, we then looked at the offer to purchase and conveyancing process, and what I did was I spoke about just the essential elements of an offer to purchase, as well as the other elements you need to consider. And we went through a whole lot of them, but the big thing we focused on was suspensive conditions, and putting in suspensive conditions that both protect you in the process, but also that you can use to your advantage when you're getting into looking at future properties. Sorry, you've seen the wrong slides. So I'm just going to fix this quickly. Just check. Cool. And then we then looked at the conveyancing process, and that's where we had Cara from Hadar Incorporated just go through the conveyancing process with you and explain the conveyancing process when you're buying a property. And then day four, we spoke about tools and research. So, it's all great looking at property and going spending time with an agent and looking at property and assuming but you really need to start looking at data and making decisions that remove the emotion out of buying a property and really go down to the nuts and bolts of why am I buying this property, and we use data as much as possible to justify our purchase. And the tools that we use, went to similar tools, include Lightstone, Google Earth, Property24, Private Property, TPN, and Uber. And I went through each of those, just discussing the use of those tools through your investment process. And then I spoke about research and understanding what you need to understand in terms of an area where you're going to invest in an area, the macro side and the micro side. On the macro side, we're really talking about the economy, the greater economy, and how that's affecting things. And I mean, there's no better time than now to understand that. And then micro economy in terms of what's happening within that specific area, that neighborhood, that street, on that block, on that side of the road. You need to understand what's happening and where it sits within the property cycle, so that you can understand that you're buying property at the best possible time. I recommended a book there by AJ Ahuja called Beating the Property Clock. And it's definitely worth getting the book and taking a read to understand the property clock itself and where that property that you're looking at might be sitting in the property cycle. It's important that we look to be buying in a buyer's market, not obviously selling in a seller's market. And then last week I spoke about running the numbers, and running the numbers really, we went through a whole lot of numbers. I spoke about loan to value, deposit amounts, mortgage payments, repayment, the total purchase costs, so giving an idea of what the total cost of buying a property is, your investment requirements, which really is money out of your pocket when you're investing in the property, the gross rental yield, and why that's just an indicator, not a really useful tool for you to be buying property on. Operating costs, so how much of it costs to actually operate your business of investing in property, And then the big one, which is return on investment, that's really your decision-making tool to decide whether you actually are going to buy that property today or not. And just to refresh on return on investment as a percentage is the annual net income, which is the gross rent minus finance costs minus operational costs divided by the investment requirements, the money out of your pocket, gives you a return on investment. And you can compare that number to how much money you get in return on an annualized basis from the bank or anywhere else. And then today we're talking about property management, just briefly the Rental Housing Act and then evictions. And we're going to get started on that today. So first thing is what I wanted to do was take property management and break it down into portions. And I think it's important that you understand that property management is often seen as an overarching thing, I manage a property, but really it's got three important elements again within it. It's got the management of the property itself, the management of the tenants themselves, and the management of the business. And those are three different elements, and you can actually contract out each of those portions if you really want to. Often our business owner Realty will manage the property and the tenancy side, and you yourself will take care of the business side. But you can also just contract out the property side, or just the tenant side, or the business side itself by hiring somebody that can do that. So I'm going to go through each of these elements and be able to just go through them for you, go through these and then discuss each of the elements briefly for you. So I'm just going to pull this up and see. Okay, cool. Okay. So from the property management side, the very first thing, and I want to talk about sort of the elements you need to focus on to make sure that you have a really good investment. One thing you need to really remember in terms of property and property rentals is the single biggest cost to a landlord or property investor is an empty property. The mortgage, the holding costs, everything else, they don't stop, and you've got to carry on paying those. And the minute you've got to take that money out of your pocket and make payment towards it, that becomes your single biggest cost. So an empty property is the most expensive type of property you can get, and you must make sure that you've got a tenant in there. How do you make sure from a property management perspective that you've got a tenant in there? And ultimately it comes down to pricing. Often we see landlords who have priced a property according to what they've been recommended by the selling agent, by the developer. They've seen a rent in the area, and I think they're going to achieve the high end. Now, there's two things here, two reasons that might happen. They haven't really done their research properly, especially if it's overpriced. They haven't done their research properly, maybe slightly greedy, or they've been misinformed. And you really need to make sure that you get your pricing absolutely right. The reason that any property doesn't rent out is 99.9% of the time that there's a price. Because there's a price for anything, and there's a price for any property. If you get that wrong, you often sit with that property empty. Now, also you need to understand from a pricing point of view, if you price your property slightly high, so let's use a 10,000 rand property as an example, and you make it 11,000 rand, and you're willing to sit for a month or 2 months with that property empty, the cost of you sitting with that property empty for 2 months, and you still get 11,000 rand in 2 months' time, or even in a month's time, the cost of that property sitting empty for 1 month will take you a full year to recoup that loss of 1 month empty, of it sitting empty for 1 month. So you need to try and make sure that first you price it correctly and you get somebody in as quickly as possible. So pricing is vitally important. I've put everything in green is before you actually get the tenant. So it's before you're managing the tenant. Part 2 is understand your body corporate. Why is it so important to understand the body corporate? Body corporates can do a few things to your property. Is they can be really invasive in terms of how they apply the rules. They can be really difficult, and you might find tenants might not want to live there. They're managing the complex really badly, and then you might come across lots of special levies as an example, or the property is not well maintained, or the security is not around. So that's part 2. So they might be invasive in terms of application rules, and they might not be managing the property properly. If you suddenly start getting a whole lot of special levies, that property becomes a loss-making property. So you need to really investigate the body corporate and their finances a lot. And if you are really low level complex and this might be an issue with body corporate, get yourself involved, become a trustee, and we can certainly give you advice on becoming a trustee as well. It's a voluntary thing, it's unpaid, but obviously the trustee's job is to manage the finance of any complex. So by managing the finance of any complex, you can make sure that firstly well maintained, and secondly you're adding value to that asset, that overall asset being the complex, but obviously each individual unit in a well maintained, well financed building is more valuable than the next. Consider putting in prepaid meters for both water and electricity. It just helps in terms of management of money. You don't have a situation where the tenant maybe pays their rent but doesn't pay the utilities. You can't cut utilities off if they aren't paying them. So you really want to make sure that you are minimizing opportunities for that tenant not to pay. So I would definitely consider putting prepaid meters, electrical and water, into the property. And that just manages the costs that are associated to those where they have to pay as they use them, and it doesn't necessarily need you to be paid and then pay out to the utility provider. That just makes sure that from a financial perspective, you're exposed to less risk that they aren't going to pay. And then the last point here, before you take a tenant in, is make sure that everything that you've got in the property is hard-wearing. Now, example, he has kitchen counters. Don't use melamine kitchen counters. Invest in granite kitchen counters. Just use the Rustenburg, that dark black granite tops. But it's much more important that you put that in rather than having to replace kitchen counters every few months or every tenancy because they've burnt the counter or there's been water issues or anything else. So put in hard-wearing items. Don't waste or don't put in cheap locks, as an example. I've learned that lesson by putting in cheap locks, and you have to very soon, not shortly after doing that, have to go and put in more expensive locks because they do break. And if you go on any premise when you invest in property, go on the premise that if it breaks, a tenant will break it. And if it's breakable, a tenant will break it. And according to tenants, everything's breakable. And if you go with that thought process in mind, you're going to make sure that you put in really hard-wearing items. I just want to really re-emphasize that buying cheap stuff, buying cheap locks, putting cheap hinges in areas is certainly just going to cost you much more money in the long run. So even when you're putting in, for example, new kitchen cupboards, put harder wearing, stronger, more heavy duty hinges in, as an example, and it'll prevent you having to replace them on a regular basis. Because obviously it's not only the cost of the hinge, but the cost of the labor doing that work. It becomes really expensive. So hard wearing, tiling walkways, making sure bathrooms are tiled, and putting laminate flooring in bedrooms, as an example, are things that you should be doing. Painting, don't use contractor's paint. I mean, contractor's paint is basically like wiping chalk onto a wall that can be wiped off with a sponge. Invest in really good hard-wearing paint, and you'll only have to paint your property once every 10 years. Because really good, expensive paint up front, you just wipe a wall with a wet cloth, a damp cloth, and very little things do stain those. So make sure that you're investing in the paint that is washable and will last a lot longer. When you now have a tenant in and you want to provide management really comes around prevention of damage, essentially, in terms of the property. And what the very first thing you need to do is provide the tenant with emergency numbers. Now that can either come from a managing agency or yourself, but give an emergency number of somebody that is immediately accessible, particularly if a geyser bursts or something happens with water, because water is the thing that damages property the most. So if there's a leak, a burst pipe or burst geyser, they can phone somebody and that person can be there very quickly. Part two to that is making sure that you get somebody there that can prevent further damage, but also prevent injury. But you also want to make sure that everything you have is updated from a servicing perspective before you put your first tenant in. And that means your garage motors, gate motors, geyser, anything that's mechanical or movable or needs servicing. Make sure that all the servicing is up to date and you've got a full record of that. There's two reasons for this. You can make sure that they don't break and they're well maintained and looked after. But also, if they aren't serviced during the period of a tenancy, you can make that tenant liable for the servicing in terms of the lease agreement, because they need annual servicing as an example. So if they stay there for 2-3 years, they would have to have 2-3 services done during that period of time. So it's important that you have up-to-date servicing and then pass that information on to the tenant to ensure that they maintain that services up to date. You also want to include that service requirement in the lease agreement to make sure that they do have those services. Now, I'll speak about it a bit later, but you need to be very specific in terms of your terms in the lease agreement. So if you need the gate motor service on an annual basis every January, you need to put in special conditions. Gate motor, this model number needs to be serviced by these people every January at the cost of the tenant, to make sure that that is covered in the lease agreement. I use the word schedules, but I changed to regular. But to really have scheduled maintenance in the property at least every year, every 6 months to every year, we get a handyman in, they go through and they just take a look. They redo silicone around the bath, around the showers. They take a look at your taps, check any electrical issues. So they're really doing a general checkup of the property and just doing a few touch-ups. Silicone, as an example, if you just leave silicone and it peels off and you leave it for a couple of years, the amount of water damage that can happen just from those drips happening from showers or bath splashes is enormous. So you want to make sure that you have regular or regular scheduled maintenance done to your property. It also enables you to have your property inspected on a regular basis by using a um, trusted maintenance person that can give you feedback saying, I've been to your property, over 4 times or last year, it's really degraded. How it off terribly, they've broken this window. So it gives you an additional opportunity to have your property inspected by somebody who actually understands what they're looking at. And the last big one, which I've come across, and it was a property I rented in Cape Town when I first came to Cape Town, was the pipe work burst in the bathroom, and the landlord hadn't told us where the shut-off was. And after 40 minutes of looking for the shut-off, we had a entirely flooded property, and I found the shut-off just outside the back door. So it's important that you do provide all the shut-off locations for mains, and when I'm talking shut-off, both electricity and for water. Not only the shut-off location for the mains themselves, but make sure that you've got stopcocks put onto every single valves put onto every single tap inlet into the property, so that if the tap does burst or pipe does burst, you can actually just switch off that immediately when they're in that position. It'll definitely save you a lot of damages if something does happen from a water perspective. So provide those shut-off locations. In the UK with our properties, we actually give every single tenant almost a map of the property and give them a highlighted zone where the emergency shut-offs are, so that when something does happen, they can immediately go to that place to shut off the electricity or water, and then they're able to save a lot of damages or prevent any injury from electrical point of view. So Ryan's asked, would you recommend a high quality paint? I actually would. If you ever walk into Builder's Warehouse and you're going to paint the property yourself, for whatever reason, if you're that crazy, and you walk into the section that says contractor's paint, and you dare pick up one of those, give yourself a smack around the head, turn around and go to Dulux or Plascon or one of the other guys that have really high quality washable paints. It's very important that you use high quality washable paints. To be honest, they're actually not that much more expensive. You're talking 1,100 Rand for a big 20-litre drum. It's not that much more expensive to have a painter paint good quality paint on than the cost of buying cheap paints. Often the cheap paint, particularly if you're painting it into property that's got a different color, or you'll have to paint 3 or 4 coats anyway. So get a good thick washable paint, and it would be much better for your use or for your property going forward. So that's just quickly in terms of property. And like I said, the green area is just before you put a tenant in, and the white is after you put tenant in. A couple of little tips there for you in terms of the property. The next one is managing the tenant. Now this is managing human beings, and it's obviously something we deal with day in and day out, and have been for several years now. And human beings are absolutely unpredictable. And the problem is, before you want to really sort of manage that tenant to the nth degree to make sure that the investment, your investment, is looked after well. And tenants really can be the worst thing, but they can also be the best thing. So rule number 1 when it comes to a tenant is make sure prevention is better than cure. You really want to make sure that you are putting a good tenant in, rather than rushing, just putting any tenant in to get that income, and then you sit with a bad tenant, because that is the worst possible situation you can sit in. So putting a good tenant in, take your time, put a good tenant in, is much more important than just having a tenant in your property. So screening is vitally important. When it's all about screening, I'm not only talking about credit checks, I'm talking about credit check, affordability, previous landlord, not even the immediate previous landlord, 2 previous landlords before, employment references, making sure they are actually working, checking the affordability from a bank statement point of view, and then just overall sense checking your gut feel in terms of this tenant. Now, obviously, if you have an agent in place, you need to make sure an agent is working on your property that understands the screening process, but also is able to gauge a tenant from just their meeting, and has a bit of logic sometimes. Often you get a tenant who arrive and then views a property, and then when you get all the ID documents, it's a completely different person. And some agents are so desperate to get somebody in that they won't actually connect the dots, or they've done so many viewings they actually can't remember the face of the person that came to view the property, and then they received the wrong documents. So you really need somebody who can screen the property very, very well, whether that's yourself or your agent. You need to trust that process. And please make sure you get a full deposit. I've heard so many stories of people either not taking deposits, which is now becoming a more regular thing, or taking payments towards deposit over a period of time. And payment one comes in, but then you never get a payment again, and you chase the deposit and chase the deposit. There's one of two things here. If you really feel that there's a need, you trust this tenant, you're willing to take a deposit on a payment plan, make sure it's defined in the lease agreement very, very clearly, and of portion will result in a breach of the lease agreement, which means that you can take action, put them in breach, give them notice, and hopefully then have them move out or have to go down the route of eviction. But make sure that's clear, very clearly defined within the lease agreement that if they are going to pay a deposit in portions of a period of time, that the date that they need to pay, when they need to pay, the amount they need to pay, and if not, it becomes breach of that lease agreement. But if you really want a great tenant, what you need to do is you need to make sure you've done not only your good screening and get your deposit, but do a really thorough ingoing and outgoing inspection. Ingoing in particular, if you do a thorough ingoing inspection, that puts a tenant in a position that shows that you know the property's condition very well, you understand where everything is, and you're not taking any risks. And often you will find that landlords, particularly individual landlords, don't have the time to go and do a viewing, so they'll meet the tenant, give them the keys, and let them go through and say, just report anything to me in a couple of days' time. The issue with that is it shows the tenant that you don't know or haven't done your necessary duty in terms of Rental Housing Act, but not only that, that you aren't maybe as aware of the issues that might be in the property. And if there is something, you actually have no recourse to go after them if they damage the property, but you haven't done a full ingoing inspection. So make sure that you do a proper ingoing inspection with them. Now that can be done virtually if you do have concerns these days about the COVID virus and you don't want to be in the same space as somebody. But it's important that you do that ingoing and then that outgoing inspection in terms of the regulations. And often you need to make a decision between retaining a tenant and escalating. And you say, well, I need the rental escalation, and rental escalations are really low at the moment. They're probably within around the 2% mark. But some landlords have taken the view of, well, I want my 8 or 9 or 10%, so I want the escalation. If the tenant doesn't want to stay, then I'm gonna move them out to get a new tenant that's willing to pay. Retaining a good tenant is way more valuable, in fact, invaluable compared to an escalation, because the escalation, although you might get the escalation, it might be short-lived. You might end up putting a tenant in that doesn't pay, for example, or has other issues. Whereas if you've got a tenant who has been reliable for 12 or 24 months, they're paying, they're in the property, that's much more secure. So always retain over escalate, but make a decision obviously from a logical point of view in terms of your position and where you stand. And a key to good property management in terms of a tenant is regular open lines of communication. Now again, whether that's between your managing agent and your tenant who act on your, or the managing agent who acts on your behalf, or between yourself and the tenant, there need to be really good open lines of communication. So for example, tenant sends you a message about an issue, please reply as quickly as possible to make sure that they know that you're engaged and are looking after that property as well as possible, or that your managing agency is engaging with your tenant to make sure that the property is looked after, and not only that, that the tenant is managed fully. Particularly again, through this COVID crisis, we had a lot of tenants who you need to communicate with you because their circumstances have changed and they don't communicate. And a lot of those issues is obviously they feel ashamed potentially that they can't pay the rental, or they just put their head in the sand and try and hide. It's vitally important that there's this communication ongoing so that you can try and manage the tenants as much as possible and also mitigate any issues that might come out of changing circumstance in particular. This has been absolutely extreme situation in terms of changing circumstance, but individuals have changing circumstances often. Companies go under through no fault of their own and they lose their jobs. They might have to move. Death happens, disease happens, sickness happens. So there are things that happen in life that are changing circumstances, which is often where tenants, good tenants could potentially go bad. But you can mitigate a lot of those situations through just open lines of communication. And the last thing is just managing your business properly and fully. And I'm going to recommend firstly here is accounting for your business as well as possible. Remember, we've been speaking about property investment the whole time and about buying the right property and putting the right tenants in and managing property well. But you really need to manage your property investment business well, because it's pointless. In the beginning, we spoke about structuring your business and trying to ring fence the risk and be tax efficient and everything else. But if you're not accounting for your business accurately and properly, then it's a completely pointless process. You really need to be accounting for each individual property and your portfolio as a whole, accurately and in full, so that you can make best use of, firstly, financing opportunities if you have a profitable portfolio, but also you start looking at minimizing your tax, because you can only minimize your tax once you fully understand the picture of how your business is doing. So accounting or doing management accounts is vitally important. Now, if you want to do it yourself, I would definitely recommend Sage One Pastel. From the South African point of view, it's a really good system. It's really easy to use. It's not expensive, 197 Rand a month, I think, per company you have or per entity. So it's a really useful tool. It's for non-accountants. So Sage One Pastel is a very, very useful tool for you to be using. Or obviously, employment bookkeeper. Make sure you've got a very good expert team. And in session 2, we spoke about the expert team, but make sure you've really got a great expert team. Don't chase the cost, because cheap isn't always the best. Really look at somebody that you can work with well. And obviously, expensive doesn't mean they're the best either. But you really want to be working with people that you understand, that see your side of it, work with you, that you click with, that you have a good gut feel with, that you're comfortable that they have open to lines of communication. Your accountant needs to be good, your lawyers need to be good, they need to be knowledgeable, they need to be updated, they need to be engaging. So there's lots of things around your expert team that you need to assess to make sure that you've really got the right team around you. And again, it's not about cost often, it's about just how you work with them, and are you able to work with them? Are they able to add value to your business? Make sure you have a great lease agreement. One of the big things around property management is making sure that you really have a good lease, because when things go wrong, you need to rely on something, and that document from a property investment point of view is your lease agreement. Make sure you've got a really, really good lease agreement. Now, either that's a lease agreement that's been molded and built over the years, for example, the Realty lease agreement, or your own lease agreement where you get from a provider. Please don't go to CNA and go and buy the pre-printed version that hasn't been changed since probably 2017 or whenever their last version was linked. Really just engage with either your attorney, your expert property attorney who has a potentially very good lease agreement, or engage with somebody like ourselves who have a good lease agreement. But make sure that the lease agreement covers all aspects. I know there's landlords who put people in property with 2-page lease agreements, and there's no ways within 2 pages you can cover everything you need to make sure that you don't get yourself into issues later on. Particularly where there's maybe clauses that are conflicting or ambiguous. So make sure that you have a very, very good lease agreement that dictates your relationship going forward. And this is the last piece, is know the law. Become a bit of a student of the law. Read the Rental Housing Act. It's only 14 pages long. Read the amendments to that act, which are also only a couple of pages long. The Consumer Protection Act, the portions that really apply to leases and property investment and tenancies is not that long. So really know the law as much as possible, or have somebody like Liad who knows the law for you and you can look for advice. It's vitally important, because the phrase, or one of the phrases that I hate the most is, "Oh, that's illegal." My immediate question is, well, show me the act and the section of the act that makes that thing that you're saying illegal. Very much that. So often people will just throw out words or comments or phrases with very much partial information. And there's a lot of these Facebook warriors out there, these Facebook advisors, Facebook lawyers, let's call them, who give advice based on very minimal amounts of advice and minimal amounts of information. So know the law, and that'll stand you in very, very good stead. The last thing you want is to have a tenant in place who understands the law better than you do and makes use of that against you. So you need to know the law as much as possible. And my one thing here is, if somebody says that's illegal, ask them for the act and section of the act that makes that thing illegal. And often people, when you ask the question, sit with a mouthful of teeth at the best of times. So just quickly in terms of knowing the law, and I'm not going to dig into this, the Rental Housing Act is the thing, Rental Housing Act and the amendments are the things that really dictate our industry and run our industry from a property rental perspective. And what it defines a few things. The amendments have come in, and the latest amendment hasn't been put into law yet, I think, and that's ready for 2014, that amendment. But what it does is really dictates two things: is landlord responsibilities in terms of the property, tenant responsibilities in terms of property, and then how the housing tribunals are put together and what their powers are. And the latest amendment, for example, the housing tribunals are going to have a bit more power. There are going to be the ability to appeal their decisions. So there are a few more things that are coming into the amendment. but and it actually criminalizes a few elements as well, which is going to be really interesting to see when it comes in. Essentially, the Rental Housing Act dictates the landlord's responsibility in terms of tenant, and that is giving the tenant free use and enjoyment of the property without interruption. Their rights of inspection, they have rights of inspection, but they need to give notice in terms of that property. They have the right to receive rental from the tenant without deduction. They have the right to not have their property damaged and recoup money against the deposit should there be any damages. The tenant has free use of enjoyment of that property, has the right not to be interrupted by the landlord. It's very clear in terms of what you can and cannot do from a tenancy perspective, or in terms of responsibilities on the landlord side and the tenant side. Now, often one of the things that happens in terms of leases, that landlord says, well, it's my property, I'm just going to go in and I want to go and inspect. There's two things here. If you're a landlord that does that, please take a step back and realize that property is bricks and mortar, and very rarely is going to disappear overnight. That's the first thing. And I know, especially when you get into property in the beginning, we used to, when I first bought our first flat, I used to take a drive probably every week just down the road to go and check on the flat, and it wasn't to go into the flat, it was just to check that it's still there. That's a block of flats, it's really not going anywhere. But the reality is you are quite emotionally attached to that first, second, third property. But really, what you need to realize is that property is not going anywhere, and although you own it, you have given the right of access away to somebody else. So you've taken that right and given it to somebody else for them to make use of that property. The minute you step into property where you've leased it out without permission, you're actually trespassing on your own property. So just be very aware of that. The Rental Housing Act also dictates how you need to use deposits or make use of deposits. And I know there's been actually, more recently, it's been really interesting seeing lawyers fight over the use of deposits in terms of COVID and extreme circumstances. And it's actually interestingly brought out a couple of opinions which apply in spite of the stage of disaster we're in, or at where we are at the moment, where the deposit can, by mutual agreement, be used for certain things. But what it really says is, if you have a deposit as a landlord, you need to deposit into an account where it's going to earn interest, and then interest can't be less than the percentage of a regular savings account at the same institution. So it's really clear that the tenant must get the interest on their deposit. If you're using an estate agency, the Estate Agency Affairs Act steps in here and says, well, if the money is deposited into a agency trust account and interest is earned on it, if the agency is not mandated to pay that interest back to the tenant, then the agency will retain the interest and have to share 50% of that interest with the Estate Agency Affairs Board. Now that's the Estate Agency Affairs Board funding mechanism. From an owner realty perspective, we are mandated within our lease agreements to pay the money back to the tenants, which we don't have a problem with, and they get fully paid. So it's important that you do, as an individual landlord, if you're holding onto the deposit, that you put into an interest-bearing account. And not only that, you need to be able to show record of that deposit plus the interest earned upon the request of the tenant. So the tenant says to you, please show me where my deposit is and show me what interest is being earned. You need to be able to reflect that. Firstly, one of the other things is, as a landlord, you need to provide a receipt every time you receive a payment. But there's no requirement that you send a statement or an invoice. We've had tenants say to us, well, I'm not paying, I haven't received an invoice. That's not a requirement, although it's good practice and something you actually should be doing. The fact that they haven't received it, whether that's real or not, who knows, but the fact they haven't received it doesn't mean they can't pay. They've signed a contract which says that they need to pay X amount a month, and they know that fact from signing these agreements. So there are little elements that you need to understand from the Rental Housing Act, and it's really worth reading. Again, it's only 14 pages long. I think the index itself is 2 pages, so you've got 12 pages, plus the bits at the end which relate to the Rental Housing Tribunal. Again, so you probably into the better part of 6 pages worth of reading if you look at the Rental Housing Act on its own. So definitely worth looking at. The other portion that you need to know is about the Consumer Protection Act. And the Consumer Protection Act, the one element that keeps on coming back is Section 14, Regulation 5, and that's really the termination or cancellation of a lease agreement prematurely in terms of the 20 days notice, 20 working days notice from a tenant. Now, a tenant can give, in terms of any fixed agreement, a consumer in terms of any fixed term agreement can give 20 working days notice, and that applies to lease agreements as much as anything. They need to give 20 working days notice, and at the end of that period, they can then move out the property and the lease is terminated. The reality here is that not only is the lease terminated, but they will have to pay a reasonable penalty. And that's also important to understand that the reasonable penalty needs to be calculated in terms of considering the final regulations 5. The final regulations 5 defines, I think, 13 points that you need to consider in terms of creating or assessing that reasonable penalty. In general, though, that penalty with 13 points and everything else really comes down to the actual loss incurred by the landlord. So that's really where it comes down to. So if you, for example, have a void period immediately after that tenant moves out and that tenant should have been renting, if you have to pay extra advertising costs, if you have paid a procurement fee to put that tenant in and then leaving early, and it can be a portion according to them leaving early, all those costs can be recouped from the tenant in terms of the reasonable penalty. So it's important that that reasonable penalty is really understood. And in general, for whatever reason, people have gone out to, well, it's 2 months, and this is a 2-month number. I think really what it comes down to is 2 months attached to the reasonable portion, that it can't be really more than 2 months, and that's the reasonable limit or the ceiling on it. But really reasonable attaches to actual loss that the landlord incurs. A landlord can't profit from the fact that a tenant's going to move out early. Now, look, there might be extra driving, there might be extra, but those are actual costs that you incur for doing those things. So make sure that you limit your the reasonable penalty to the Section 14 reasonable penalty and considering Regulation 5, which is there. And again, easy to get, really easy to download from the government website. Okay. The problem is, no matter what you do, no matter how well you manage your property, no matter how well you put all the mechanisms in place, you screen the tenant, you've got the best managing agents in, no matter what you do, something happens and you just end up with this tenant and tenants go bad. And the reality is, when tenants go bad, there's nothing you can do as an individual. You really need to get the law involved. And this is where it really can get ugly. And you need to remove yourself from the situation and put into a legal process as early as possible to make sure that action is taken against the tenant and eviction procedure happens within the shortest possible time. Again, for as long as that tenant's sitting in your property not paying, that is potentially the most expensive time that you're sitting with the property, is when it's empty or when you've got a non-paying tenant. And this is where I'd like to introduce Lead Haydar. And Lead Haydar is an expert attorney in evictions, expert property attorney, runs a law firm out in Santon, and I'm going to just ask Lead to pop onto the screen. Lead, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool. And it's just start your video for me there as well. So I'm going to let Lead do a quick introduction of himself, and then he's also going to share his screen. He's got a presentation for you guys. So Lead, I'm going to just unshare my screen for you. So having one of those share screening days. So, there we go. Cool. So, Leah, thanks for joining us today and sharing your expertise and knowledge around evictions and tenants. And I want to leave it with you to go ahead.
Great, thanks, Grant. It's really great to be on this forum. I know we spoke previously about a few things, and I love sharing my knowledge with you and with people that are connected to you. So just to talk about evictions, residential evictions in particular, what we do here is we specialize in property law, and within property law we specialize in residential, commercial, industrial properties and property management. What that means is we help landlords collect the rental, we help landlords evict tenants that don't pay or that just hang around after their lease expires. Even if they do pay, by the way, you can actually say, I don't want you here anymore once your lease expires. It's a little nuance we'll deal with later. But in general, I'll just give my advice on property management, rental collections, and then in particular evictions. So, it all starts when you get a tenant in, and you touched on it, Grant, and it's really important. You need to vet your tenants properly. You need to have property managers or placing agents, which are really good. They need to do background checks on these tenants. They need to make sure you're not getting a dud. The reason I say all of this is because it takes one bad tenant to really destroy your return on your property. Never mind not getting rental from the tenant, but being stuck with a tenant that's not paying in the premises for a prolonged period of time is really a killer for any landlord and any investor in property. And I think you've touched on so many important points. One of them being use experts, surround yourself with experts who know what they're doing. And I've said this before in one of my presentations, it doesn't matter which lawyer you go to, as long as they specialize in property law. So some are more expensive, some are cheaper, some are nicer to deal with, some aren't. But the reality is, if you go to an attorney who doesn't know the PI Act, which is the Eviction Act, I'll deal with in detail just now, or doesn't understand property law, or doesn't understand the Rental Housing Tribunal and the Act, you're going to be in trouble. The reason I say that is it's going to take you longer, it's going to cost you more, and you'll probably not get the result, or you won't get it as quick as you should have and as cost effective as you should have. So in speaking about that, you've got to go to experts. I mean, you wouldn't go for surgery at your GP, right? You'd go to your surgeon, a specialist surgeon, if you needed some special surgery. And that's the same thing with property law. Not all attorneys know it. Some dabble in it, which is great, but I think for their own knowledge, it's great, but it's not good for the client ever. So what we do at Hadar Incorporated is only property law. And we actually, as long as it's linked to property, we do it. So for example, if you come to us for competition law, we can't help you, but if it's linked to property law, we can. Same with criminal law. We don't get involved, but if it's got to do with a landlord and tenant relationship, we'll get involved and assist. But our core real work is the property management side of things, which is the rental collection and evictions. So just from a rental collection point of view, and I know it's not the focus of this discussion, you've just got to make sure you follow the processes of your lease carefully. I love the fact that you mentioned earlier that your leases have to be good, because that is the number one issue that we have when people come to us and new clients come to us and hand over a lease that is a two-pager, doesn't cover the important and salient facts that are necessary, or the paperwork's bad, or the tenant's address isn't confirmed in there, or the tenant's name is not in there. It becomes an impossible job, and it's just going to count against you. So absolutely start with good lease agreements. I think you guys have a very good lease. We also do. We're happy to help anyone that needs a good lease. TPN have good leases. You know, there's so many good leases out there. Just make sure you use a good one. And if you ever have questions, I always extend this to Grant and everyone connected to him. Email us, call us. Happy to assist. Just give a bit of advice and added value. You don't have to be so formal that we have to open a file and charge you for it. You can literally just email us and pop us a question. So when we move on to evictions, because I think that is the focus here. I'm just going to share my screen. In 1 second, Grant, I think I can't share screen. It says that it's disabled. So just if you can authorize me to do that.
There we go, sorted.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to open my presentation. And then I'm just going to run this presentation for everyone. Okay. So basically, I've started obviously the fact that we are Hadar Incorporated, and you'll see that we say we're property law specialists, and it's important to note that because we don't practice in anything else. We do conveyancing, as Cara was on this presentation not so long ago, on this forum, and it's all we do. I'm going to speak about what we consider ourselves to be, which is the landlord's partner. Now, I don't mean that in a bad way. What I mean by that is it will help tenants, bona fide tenants who have legitimate issues and have paid their rent and everything else. But generally, we have a very strong bias towards the landlord. That's our client, that's our main focus, and that's the core of what we do. We also known around the local circles by the tenants as the tenant's nemesis, because you know we really just we fight for the landlord's right. We go over and above just to get rental paid or to get the tenants out. And it's not seen, obviously, as a favorable position by tenants, but our job is to act for the landlord. Just as a little, just as a joke, I kind of show people what eviction specialists do. A lot of people think that we just sit in court and argue. Clients think we just kind of take it easy. Society think that we, kind of just make money as lawyers. What we actually do, and that's the bottom right-hand side, is probably the most relevant thing, is a lot of admin and paperwork. Of course, we go to court. Of course, there's those Harvey Specter moments where we argue a brilliant case and it turns on a matter and we get the eviction order with some sort of moment of genius. But the reality is your paperwork has to be immaculate. It has to be absolutely in order. It has to be organized from the property manager side, from your side as the landlord, from the vetting side, right at the beginning, everything has to be in order, and eventually you do drown in paperwork, but that's why you need a good team around you on every level. So to talk about evictions, residential evictions in particular, I'll start off by just comparing commercial versus residential. Commercial is very, very easy. It's an office park usually. It's just, two entities enter into a lease agreement, and it's quite simple, right? I mean, it's not as emotional and as personal. So the actual processes in court to evict a commercial tenant, much quicker, much easier than residential. So speaking about residential, obviously the three things that are very much at play are the PI Act, which I'll deal with shortly, the fact that there are more processes involved because it's a residential premises as opposed to commercial premises, and the fact that it is potentially emotional. I mean, we all know this, whether we're landlords or tenants, and sometimes we can be both, by the way. Obviously, you can rent from someone and own your own premises and rent that to someone else, but there is emotion involved. It's a person's place of living. It's their home, whether it's temporary, it's not theirs, but they're renting it from you. It's still their safe place. And that's something to bear in mind. When people speak to us as Hadar Incorporated, they know that we, the proverbial bulldog attorneys, we get the results. But that's not to say that we don't also litigate with empathy. We absolutely do. We're very mindful of the landlord's feelings always as our client. We're also mindful of the tenant's feelings, because I think it's important to actually not come in guns blazing unless it's necessary. And most times, if you approach the tenant as a human being, I think you can get better results than you can by aggressively flying in. So we try the nice approach first, and we try to remove all emotion from it. If we're successful, it's only for the better of the landlord. It's cheaper, it's quicker, and we sign agreements. That's much better. But should that not happen, we then have to proceed with the PI eviction application. So basically, PI stands for the Prevention of Illegal Eviction from and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. This act was first drafted in 1998. So, we've got a little name for it. We call it actually the devil, because what it did for landlords is it made it that much harder to get rid of an unlawful occupant. Now, remember, if you look there, it says unlawful occupation. Unlawful occupation means a tenant who hasn't paid, who you've put under breach, who hasn't remedied the breach, and then you've cancelled. They then become an unlawful occupant. A tenant just generally is not an unlawful occupant, obviously, if they're adhering to the lease agreement. They have to become an unlawful occupant, and that's by way of following the processes involved. So to talk about the processes of the PI Act and actually just general property management when it comes to residential properties, you have to start with something we call a pre-stage. The pre-stage is a letter of demand, also known as a breach notice, which gives the tenant 20 business days to remedy their breach. The 20 business days is in respect of the Consumer Protection Act. Consumer Protection Act, another one of those acts that came into play to assist consumers and assist tenants, is something that we have to just be aware of and know our way around. It doesn't render evictions impossible. And by the way, let me just pause to mention that we have a motto here with regards to residential evictions, because a lot of people say, once you have to go and evict it, you're done. You'll never be able to do it. Guys dig their heels in and they'll be unlawful occupants for years. And that's not the truth. If you don't know what you're doing, perhaps that's the case. But as attorneys who specialize in evictions and rent collections, in particular residentials, we have a motto, and the motto is it's a question of when, not if. There's no if, it will happen. The tenant will be evicted. It's just how long will it take? How well do they know the processes, and how well do we run our processes from an efficiency point of view? So the letter of demand, which has to have a 20 business day notice in order for the tenant to remedy their breach, is in terms of the CPA, Consumer Protection Act. Should the tenant, after being properly served with it, and that's an important point, what's proper service? It depends what your lease says. If your lease says that you can serve a letter of demand or breach notice by way of an email, and it's confirmed in the lease agreement, and there's an email address that's working, great. You can just have to email that letter of demand to the tenant. Make sure you have a sent item, obviously, on your Outlook, and maybe a red receipt if you can, and then you're good. You've served the letter properly. If it doesn't have provision in the lease for service by way of a email, then you must deliver by hand. That's generally what the lease will say, or register post. I don't like register post, mainly because it's not effective. It doesn't reach the tenant like 95% of the time, and because it just takes longer. So by hand is perfect, or by email if allowed during the lease. When the 20 business days expire and the tenant doesn't remedy the breach, then you've got to take the next step, which is a cancellation or termination notice. Same thing applies. It has to go by email if it's allowed to, or it has to go by hand if it doesn't allow email service. You have to make sure that it's delivered properly and that it reaches the tenant. If they're not there, you can slide it under the door, but you have to make sure that you've got some sort of proof. I always take a photo. The letter's been slid under the door. I make a note of the time I did it and the date. There's little nuances which you don't really need to know. Your attorney should know, or your property manager should know. But I'm just throwing it all in for now, for the sake of completeness. So once you've cancelled the lease or terminated it with that second letter, after the breach has been remedied, you're in a position now to demand and insist that the occupant leaves. Now they've become an unlawful occupant. So you can even ring them up or email them and say, look, I gave you a demand, I then cancelled, you're still in occupation, you're in unlawful occupation, please leave. If you can somehow get them to agree a certain date, even if it's 2-3 weeks down the line, you're winning. It's so much better than going to an attorney and having to evict. This sounds counterproductive from a business point of view, but absolutely it's better for a landlord, and that would be my wish on all of you. If you ever have to get into a position with an unlawful occupant, is that you manage to negotiate an exit. If not, though, you'll obviously go to an expert attorney, a specialist in property law, again, please, not just any random general practitioner who hopes to learn about property, on your account. And you have to issue the 3 stages. So it's quite clinical, but we call it stage 1, 2, and 3. And stage 1, simply said, is when you issue an eviction application. To not bore you with all the details, what it means is we prepare an affidavit for you to sign, have commissioned at the police station or in front of another attorney or bank manager. And it says, I am the landlord. I am the registered owner of the property. I entered into a lease agreement with a tenant. The tenant was supposed to pay X amount rands per month, fell into arrears. I sent him a letter of demand, which he failed to remedy, and I attached the letter. I then sent him a cancellation notice or termination notice as a result of his failure or her failure to remedy the breach. I'm now an unlawful occupant, and I asked the court to come to my aid and to grant me an eviction order. And that affidavit is signed, given back to us, and we go to court to have it issued. We issue the eviction application. It goes to the sheriff. Sheriff then serves it on the occupant. At this point, it must be noted that the whole act of having a sheriff knock on your door and serve you with an eviction application is very, very good from a landlord's point of view. It's effective. It gets the unlawful occupant to realize you're not joking. You're not just sending letters. Even if you're sending lawyers letters and for some reason they weren't effective in scaring the tenant or the occupant, then at least when they get served by an official application, they know that you are serious. And what happens next is they've got 5 business days to oppose the application. I think I actually deal with it just now. So if you look at this little kind of breakdown, I speak about default, I speak about the letter of demand, and then speak about eviction applications. So what happens here, if you look at number 3, eviction applications, we issue the eviction application in court, we instruct the sheriff, and the sheriff then serves it on the tenant or unlawful occupant. They've then got, the unlawful occupant has 5 business days to oppose the eviction application. Now, the next common question then is, why would they oppose it? On what basis? There is no basis. They don't need to have a basis. It's what they do. A lot of unlawful occupants panic. They don't know what to do, so they oppose it. Or they go to attorneys who say, rather than paying the landlord money, pay me 5,000 rand or whatever it is, and let me oppose the application and buy you some time. So they serve an intention to oppose within those 5 days. And if they do, then they have a further 15 business days to file opposing papers. Their opposing papers pretty much would have to set out their defense or their opposition of the application. For argument's sake, a good ground for opposition would be the landlord never served the letter of demand on me. The landlord never served the termination notice on me. Those are all technical points which would be good. Alternatively, a very good ground for opposition would be, I'm actually up to date on my payment. I don't know what the landlord's talking about. Here's all my proofs of payment. I've paid everything to date, and this application is completely wrong. The next step would then be, either way, whether they oppose it or not, is something called the Section 4.2. This is called stage 2. What this means really is, if the unlawful occupant doesn't oppose the application, the court kind of needs further assurances that they've been served with the application, that they haven't opposed it, but that they are aware of it. The courts are very much loath to grant eviction orders. You can understand in South Africa, with its strong constitution and constitutional rights to housing, Section 26 of the Constitution, the courts are very much in favor of assisting potential homeless people. What that means is they want to make sure, 150% sure, that you have been served with the eviction application if you are going to be rendered homeless or if you have to move homes. So Section 4.2 is just a second step for us to follow, which is in part of the Power Act. And we go to court and we say, we've served the eviction application by a sheriff, he has the proof, there's no opposition, please can we proceed to the final hearing? Court says fine, gives us an order to say, I note what's happened, and please go and serve the final date on the unlawful occupant. All that happens in this stage is the court says, that's okay, you can proceed, but make sure that the occupant is once again advised of a hearing date. You're then going into stage 3 then, right, which is your actual hearing date. And what happens is, at that hearing date, you repeat what you've said in affidavit. We stand up before court and we say, court, we've served our eviction application by sheriff, there was no opposition, the Section 4.2 was granted, that was also served on the unlawful occupant, they're not here, they're not opposing the application, please give us an eviction order. The court says they're fine, they're satisfied with it, and they grant an eviction order. It's granted, we give it to the sheriff. Obviously, we don't go and evict people ourselves, although it would be very nice. But sheriff goes to the premises with an order in hand, and he says, you've got to get out. This is just a real footage of someone getting evicted from their house. Let's see if it plays out. I don't know if these videos play or not. I don't think they do, but we had just a joke of a video kind of watching. You can see someone getting thrown out of their property. Obviously, it's not a laughing matter, but we try and make light of it because that's what we do daily. So, talking about potential pitfalls, right? And then I touched on this right at the beginning, and this goes to property management and what Grant was speaking about, and it's critical. You have to vet your tenants properly. You have to make sure that everything is absolutely vetted properly. You've got to make sure that you don't get a dud. I said this earlier. The biggest issue is taking on a tenant with a terrible credit rating, someone who you just know will not pay you. I mean, at the best of times, remember, you're entering into an agreement, quite an intimate agreement. You're letting someone into your property. Someone's going to be living in your property, and you don't really know them. I mean, you enter into agreement on face value. So the best you can do is look into their background, make sure they've got no judgments against them, do a credit check, speak to previous landlords. There's a number of things you can do to really save yourself time and money in the long run and a lot of pain. The second thing is not taking action is a big issue. What I mean by that is, the minute a tenant goes into arrears and doesn't pay rent, don't wait. Do not wait 3 weeks to then think, okay, maybe I should demand payment formally. Take action the next day. Say, where's my money? I'm a property owner. I've got my own bills to pay. I need you to pay your rent. If they don't pay, instruct an attorney or instruct, again, a specialist, or instruct your property manager to send a proper and formal letter of demand out with the 20 business days to your tenants. Get the time period ticking, because you still have to wait 20 business days anyway. So don't delay, because the longer you wait, the longer you have to wait until you get an eviction order in the matter. The third thing is not following processes. What I mean by that is kind of taking, and that talks to the fourth point, taking the law into your own hands. Doing things unlawfully, like locking out and not doing things properly, can only count against you. Really, it's going to cost you in the long run again. You've got to follow the right legal processes. You can't just lock people out. It might be effective in the short term, but if they run to court, and this is the, I guess, absurd thing in law, but you'll understand why. So there's no kind of jungle law out there. If I just lock my tenant out, if he goes to court, he will be reinstated, even if he owes me 400,000 Rand in rental. The reason being is I took the law into my own hands. I should have gone to the court in the first place. Now, if I locked him out unlawfully, I don't have clean hands. I can't go before the court, and he will be successful in something called spoliation application. He will be reinstated, even though he's in massive arrears, and you will get a cost order against you. So taking the law into your own hands is never, ever a good idea. It should never be done. Rather, take your medicine and follow the legal processes. And the last point is non-instructing proper attorneys. And proper is such a loose word, but what I mean by that is, again, and I'll mention it 100 times, it's attorneys who don't know property law, who are practicing on your account, who are just hoping that it works out, and attorneys who aren't legitimate. And there's many out there who purport to be attorneys, but are actually legal advisors in inverted commas, and they don't know what they're doing. So these are my potential pitfalls which must be avoided. I'm not really going to talk about auction and repo properties, but just to touch on it, PI Act's applicable at any point that there's residential occupants in a premises, and you've got to follow the processes. Even if you buy a property of auction, as long as there's someone living in there, a tenant or an unlawful occupant, and it's considered a residential place of them living there, you have to follow and comply with the PI Act. And then practical advice that I've got for any landlord is always approach the tenant or the unlawful occupant and try your best to resolve the matter without going legal. Again, it's counterproductive to my business, but in reality, if every landlord could resolve their issue without us, we'd have other things to do. We could take care of other disputes, but insofar as an eviction application is concerned, the best possible outcome is something we consider a soft exit, which means you say, listen, stay for free even for another 2 or 3 weeks and then leave. Enter into a settlement agreement. That's something we can help you with. If we're really looking on how to add value in such a situation. But try approach them first. Try make it humane. Say, you're in trouble. You've got your bond to pay. You understand they're not paying and they need to leave. And in a couple of weeks to find a new place and move in with their mother, whatever the case is, try assist them because it will save you a lot of money in the long run. The second point that I've got is avoid delays and act timeously. Again, don't wait. Don't put your head in the sand and have the ostrich mentality and just hope that everything gets better. It won't. The minute a tenant goes into arrears, it's statistically, and Grant will back me up on this, it just gets worse. The longer it carries on, the worse it gets. And then I always suggest be firm but fair. So that goes to the humane element. Speak to them, understand their people. And I know we get very, very upset because they owe us money and it is emotional. But so be firm, but be fair. Don't take the law into your own hands. Don't do anything silly. Try and negotiate the best exit possible and get the best possible result for you without having to go fully aggressive and have lawyers involved and everything else. And this is the section, I guess, now there's questions and answers. Grant, you can take the lead on that. And if there's anything to answer, I'm more than happy to help with.
Cool. Brilliant. Thanks, Gary. That was cool. Good. So, yeah, if we've got a couple of questions here, which I will ask, but if you do have any questions to ask, Liad, just let us know as well, and I'll pose them to you. The first question here is the argument of a tenant having, number one, lost employment, and number two, having no alternative accommodation. How does it affect the court's posture or decision during the eviction process?
So it's an interesting question. Everyone's jumped on the COVID-19 bandwagon and force majeure, vis majeure. I mean, people are writing articles all over the place for and against it, for tenants and against tenants, and for landlords and against landlords. The bottom line is that the court doesn't consider anything except, are you in arrears? Have you been placed under breach? Have you remedied your breach or not? And have you been cancelled, right? So that's one of the major considerations from a procedural point of view. When it comes to the other aspect of it, the PI Act specifically says that you will get an eviction order, but a court must still consider certain factors. What does that mean, certain factors? It means women-headed households, it means disabled people, it means minor children. Those are very much important factors. It doesn't mean a court won't grant an eviction order. What it means is they'll be a bit more lenient. So where they might give a 2-week notice for a tenant to vacate before they get evicted, they might get a month and a half, even 2 months. I know it sounds absurd because the court's allowing them to remain in occupation for 2 months without paying effectively, but they have to consider personal circumstances. One of them is not earning an income. If it's, for example, just a male bachelor, a 25-year-old bachelor staying on a premises, he won't be a consideration insofar as the PI Act is concerned. And the fact that he lost his job, the court won't say, I'm not granting an eviction order. Unfortunately, that's the nature of a landlord-tenant relationship. If you don't pay, you get cancelled.
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation around that. There's a lot of misinformation around vulnerable, vulnerable people and what the court may or may not. Ultimately, it's not the private landlord's responsibility to take care of vulnerable people, but more the states anyway. So that's something to just keep in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. The quick sort of a follow-on to that question was you mentioned a lot of articles written around force majeure and everything else in COVID-19. What about the idea of the courts considering Ubuntu and almost making it a requirement that a landlord has shown some sort of Ubuntu to a tenant before they're actually going to give an order?
So I'm very, very opinionated about this point about Ubuntu, because I strongly believe in it, right? That's the interesting thing, but I strongly disagree with it at the same time. So there's another attorney, still in the state, Mr. Salah, who we're quite close, Grant actually introduced us, and we speak about this and we debate them openly, and she's got stronger feelings than I do on Ubuntu insofar as, how applicable it is. I'm very much aware of it. I'm empathetic towards it. I believe in Ubuntu on many, many levels, personal and professional. But we've got to cut to the chase. And the fact is, case law in our country recognizes Ubuntu, but doesn't make it an overriding provision. What I mean by that is the courts to date have never accepted that Ubuntu is a reason not to evict someone or not to have them comply with the contract. In any aspect, any commercial contract, any sort of contract, it doesn't have to be a landlord and tenant lease agreement. What I mean by that is, and I research this extensively because it often comes up these days as an opposition when we try to bring eviction applications or try to force someone to pay in terms of a lease agreement. The courts consider it, it's an important South African concept, but it never overrides and it's not stronger than the principle of sanctity of contract. What that means is your right to contract and the fact that you enter into a contract freely overrides the principle of Ubuntu. So let's say this, if you had to go to court and I act for the landlord with a sanctity of contract argument saying that parties entered into the agreement and they're supposed to be bound by it, and someone acts on behalf of the tenant and says Ubuntu, the sanctity of contract will outweigh the Ubuntu principles and I'll win. I will win. It's just a matter of the court being empathetic towards it and saying we understand there's a reasonableness involved, but it doesn't override sanctity of contract. Otherwise, there'd be no need to enter into lease agreements, right? I mean, everyone would just say, look, enter into a 2-year lease agreement. After 1 month, I lost my job. Please let me stay here for 6 months rent free. How can the court ever condone that? You've got to be mindful of Ubuntu, but understand that sanctity of contract is always more powerful, and that's our case law at the moment.
And I mean, the court itself applies the principle of Ubuntu when it says, look, you may be a vulnerable person or your circumstance requires that you stay for 4 weeks instead of 2 weeks rent-free before you move out. So that's where the Ubuntu portion might come into the decision-making process. But it doesn't affect your eviction procedure or that against contract, like you say.
No. Right. In fact, the PI Act is inherently has an Ubuntu principle to it because it looks at the most disadvantaged, people that need help, kind of women-headed households, disabled people, and minor children. It looks at them already to protect them. It's inherently built in the Ubuntu principles in our law, which is great. Yeah. And I actually agree with it because taking away now the position as a landlord partner and landlord's attorney, when you look at a young lady with a 6-month-old baby and you say you need to get out within a week, it is harsh. And the courts do need to come to her assistance and say, give her a bit longer, give her a month and a half. I absolutely back it. I completely agree with it. But we need to all understand, Ubuntu is not a defense to not pay and to unlawfully occupy our premises, never.
Awesome. So I've got another question here, which is from the same person, Eppeling, which is Eppeling's our regular Q&A person. It's great. So saying, if illegal occupants are vacate the building, she hears that the municipality often offers them alternative accommodation. So that's sort of back into the space where the state must take care of its citizens and not the private landlord.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's been landmark cases on this, and all my fellow experts in property law discuss this often. There was a case which the Blue Moon case, which actually did confer or obligate the municipality to provide alternative accommodation. This is all theoretical. Practically, unfortunately, the reality in South Africa, the municipalities does not provide any sort of alternative accommodation, or very rarely does. And they sometimes get joined, or they often get joined as as a respondent to our application, just to prove that we've actually served on them, and then we're going to evict someone and potentially render them homeless. It's on them as a municipality, the city of Joburg, for example, when we do Johannesburg evictions, to come up with alternative accommodation because of the relevant case law, but it doesn't stop our position. It's actually more for the tenant to attack the municipality and say, well, where do you want me to go? It doesn't. What I want to say is the most important thing from here is it doesn't affect our eviction application, whether or not they are afforded alternative accommodation or not.
And then a question from David Roberts, who's joined us for all 6 of the series as well. He's saying the tenant is breached to move out, and there's a dispute about funds. So obviously dispute around the deposit. Can one still put another contracted tenant in, or do you have to wait until the original tenant case is sorted out before you
bring them in as soon as you can? Bring in a new tenant. Mitigate your losses. Don't wait for anything. With regards to dispute of funds, that's irrelevant. Once they're out, you can always discuss it. You can go to the Rental Housing Tribunal in particular to discuss kind of deposit funds, because it sounds like that's what he's asking about. It's actually a great forum to go to because it's free. You don't have to use an attorney. You can go represent yourself. And then they're quite decent. I mean, I've seen some shocking decisions, but I've also seen some good ones. So it's definitely an option to go there.
Brilliant. Cool. That seems to be all the questions we've got for you, Leah. So I really appreciate your time, and thanks for going through the evictions. And hopefully everyone sees it's not as scary. It's just about being sort of thorough in your process and acting as soon as possible. So appreciate your time. And what I'll do is, and if your email address is leah@haydarinc.co, is that right?
That's right. I was going to say that, please share my details with everyone that's listening. We love adding value. We love answering questions. As I said, it's not formal. You don't have to schedule a meeting. You just email us or call us. And we'd love to help. Hopefully you never do. I always see it like, my dentist is a hell of a nice guy, but I only go to him when I have to have my tooth pulled out or something painful. And, I wouldn't go to Lenny, the dentist, just for fun. So hopefully you don't see us often, but when you do, just know we'll get rid of that bad tooth. That's all we'll do.
That's awesome. Your forward tooth. That's good. Good analogy. That's great. So yeah, Leah, again, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. And guys, that's the end of the property investment series from my perspective. We've had 6 weeks or 6 sessions. So just thank you for everybody that has joined everybody that has spent some time, asked questions. It's been a good experience again.